All right. Hello, everybody. Can anybody out there hear me? I think we might be having a little bit of a tech problem, so I want to just make sure everybody in the comments, if you can hear me, please comment that you can, in fact, hear what I'm saying. Maybe not. I'm not sure. Anybody can just, in the chat, just let me know if they hear me. I can hear. Okay, all right. So then we are having a little bit of a tech issue, but hopefully this will go all right. So hello and welcome back to Right America. Thank you everyone for letting me know that you can hear. I'm happy to be back here for another week of Right America. I had a little time off, but I'm excited to be back here with you all for Right America, which is our literary series spearheaded by author Roger Rosenblatt in an effort to bridge the great divide in our country through readings and conversations from award-winning, nationally renowned authors and new and emerging writers. My name is Lauren. I am the publicist and event coordinator over at Book Review. So for those of you who are not familiar with our store, Book Review is Long Island's largest independent bookstore. We've been open since 1977, so it's been about 44 years now. I am super excited to be back here with writers Paul Auster and Siri Hustvedt. If you missed last week's episode with Daniel Halpern and Natalie Diaz, you can watch that episode or any of the previous episodes of Right America right on our Crowdcast channel. Every single event with us on Crowdcast is recorded. So if you miss any of them, you can go back and watch them at any time. Tonight's is also being recorded, so it will live there as well. Before we get started with the readings, there is a few things that I would like to show you about Crowdcast that you'll need to know for the event tonight. First off, there is a button right down here. If you click that button, it'll do exactly what it says. It'll bring you to our website where you can purchase signed copies of Paul and Siri's books. If you have questions for either of the speakers tonight, we do have a little button down here. I think I'm pointing at it. It says ask a question. You can just drop your questions right down there. And then I see that you have all found the chat. If you're having sound problems, maybe just try refreshing the page. That might work. But yes, so we are going to get started. So up first, we have a reading from Siri Hustvedt. Siri is the author of a book of poetry, 6 essay collections, 7 novels, and a work of nonfiction. Siri has a PhD from Columbia University in English literature and an appointment as lecturer in psychiatry at Weill Cornell Medical College. Her novel, The Blazing World, was longlisted for the Man Booker Prize and won the Los Angeles Book Prize for Fiction. She has been awarded the International Gabaron Prize for Thought and Humanities, an American Academy of Arts and Letters Award for Literature, and the Princess of Asturias Award in Spain. Her work has been translated into over 30 languages. So let's welcome Siri Hustvedt. All right. So just for all of you out there, they are having a sound problem. They can't hear me at all. So we don't know what's going on tonight. It's a little bit of a weird one. So Siri, so take it away.
So we cannot hear our wonderful host. And so this is a little peculiar, but I say thank you, and since we're starting with the reading, I'm just going to begin. Paul is getting out of the way. He doesn't have a computer. This is mine, and my computer may be the source of the problem. But anyway, all you need to know is that I'm going to read from part of chapter 2 of my most recent novel, Memories of the Future, was published in 2019. There is a narrator who, while she's moving her mother from independent living to assisted living, discovers an old notebook that she kept when she was 23 years old. She had first moved to New York, and at the time she knew no one. The other thing you should know is that the Baroness Elsa Freytag von Loringhoven was a Dada poet and artist, and the narrator's sister's name is Kari. The young woman who whiled away her late afternoons at the Hungarian pastry shop in early September of 1978 did not go there only to escape the confines of her small, dimly lit apartment, or her chanting neighbor, or to plan the rest of her novel, or to try to make sense of Edmund Husserl, whose mysterious sentences in logical investigations she read over and over again. She went to the Hungarian pastry shop and seated herself at a table she regarded as well situated because it had a clear view of the door and every person who entered or left the establishment. From that felicitous spot, she could easily glance up from her coffee and her book and take note of any and all interesting strangers. She whiled and idled and was known to waste her money on cappuccinos and croissants because she lived in a state of perpetual suspense. She, like her hero Feathers, spent much of her time in the subjunctive tense, projecting herself into as-if cases and the innumerable illustrious possibilities that awaited her, charming company at the least, torrid passion at the most. In this respect, we differ, my former self and I. It was impossible for me to know at 23 that the dreadful phrase, life is short, has meaning. That at 61, I know there is far less ahead of me than behind me. And that while she wasn't terribly curious about herself as herself, I have become curious about her as an incarnation of hopes and errors that had or seemed to have had a determining effect on what I am now. While she was intent on rushing ahead on that imaginary timeline, the one that moves from left to right on the page and chronicles the evolution of organisms over millennia or Roman empires or the life of Napoleon, as if time were space and not something wholly ineffable, an invisible motion so enigmatic that to think hard about it means to lose it altogether. I am interested in understanding how she and I are relatives, which means turning around and following the timeline in the other direction, because I can't imagine time without spatial metaphors, without backward and forward, without roads behind me and ahead of me, as if I am walking through it. But then my space has only 3 grubby Euclidean dimensions. Time, the physicists tell us, is the 4th. In our plain old human world, the young woman who lifts her eyes when she hears the door open at the Hungarian pastry shop in September 1978 becomes the aging woman who sits here now in September 2016 in her study in a house in Brooklyn and types the sentence you are reading in your own present, one I cannot identify. But over there in Minkowski space-time, the still girlish I and the much older I coexist. And in that startling 4D reality, the two of us can theoretically find each other and shake hands or converse together because in the block universe, time doesn't flow or dribble or leak. And it makes no difference whether you travel into the past or into the future. My husband, Walter, tells me the mathematics work out beautifully. And when he explains it to me, as he has many times, I say to him, the idea is that the motion of time is a cellular delusion. What is memory if my earlier self is still out there somewhere unchanged? And then he likes to mention the story Rudolf Carnap reported about Albert Einstein in his memoir, quote, "The problem of now worried Einstein seriously. He explained that the experience of the now means something special for men, something different from the past and future, but that this important difference does not and cannot occur in physics," end quote. And Walter finishes off this famous anecdote by noting that Carnap had little sympathy for Einstein's anxiety because he was a hard-ass logical positivist of the Vienna Circle, and Einstein's concern for human feeling mystified him. And I always say to Walter, but that meaningful now is nothing. It is as elusive as was and will be. And there is much to be gained from thinking beyond mathematics. And he agrees because he isn't a hard ass. And the problem of time is not resolved. And that is just one of the reasons why I remain so fond of my husband after all these years. But the frozen block of Walter and his physicist cohorts is rather like a library, is it not? Karl Popper's World 3 out there for all of us. In it, we can leap from after to before at will. If I choose, I can remove Plato's Apology from the shelf or pluck up the Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven's poems, now printed in a beautiful edition. And if I devise an eccentric system for my library, the two might be neighbors. Socrates explained himself in 399 BC, and then he killed himself, as everyone knows. But only a very few know, even now, that the Baroness referred often to suicide in her writings, and that she came from a family of suicides, and that tired and poor, she may have killed herself with a newly bought gas stove in her cold Paris flat in 1927. Therefore, in my library, Plato Socrates can kiss the Baroness with the hemlock still on his lips, because time is not a problem in the library, despite the fact that the ugly sage preferred boys and would no doubt have regarded the Baroness as a monster. Temporal coexistence is true of every single book as well. You can hop to page 137 and then back to page 7 20 times over. But the story or the argument is fixed, determined from first word to last. And in this particular book, the book you are reading now, the young person and the old person live side by side in the precarious truths of memory. Here I am free to dance over decades in the small white space between paragraphs, or linger over one bright minute in my life for page after page, or toy with tenses that point backward or forward. I am free to follow the earlier self with interruptions from the later self, because the old lady has perspective the young person cannot have. I meet myself on the page then, on the pages she wrote years ago and the ones I am writing now. A young woman sits in the Hungarian pastry shop on Amsterdam Avenue at 111th Street and raises her eyes from her book when she hears the door open, and they fall on a handsome stranger as he walks into the cafe. My guess is that any onlooker, if she or he had bothered to glance even for an instant at the young woman's face, would have seen hope in her expression. September 10th, 1978. Dear Paige, Hungarian pastry shop today, 4:15. Grinning young man with short, neat beard comes in and gets a coffee. Sits down at table next to me, gives me a significant nod and smile. I feel a constriction in my breathing, that pleasurable tightness of possibility. Good-looking brown hair, slender, slightly freckled straight nose with delicate nostrils that flare to reveal pale pink interior. Smallest overlap of two front teeth, a fetching flaw. He begins, names exchanged. Aaron Blinderman. My turn. That's an unusual name, he says. What is it? Norwegian, I say. Oh, Norwegian, he says. Brief explanation by me of immigrant history on both sides out there on the Minnesota prairie. Aaron seems pleased by my Nordic roots and launches into description of his anthropology thesis. Good start. I am interested in everything. Aaron is immersed in the hua of New Guinea. I know nothing of the hua and say so. My ignorance pleases him, although I can't say why. His head bobs. He smiles. I can see his chest expand. Aaron takes some time setting the Melanesian stage, living arrangements, food, and tools. I am bored. I am not entirely ignorant of anthropology. I have read Levi-Strauss. Then he speaks of something called nu, a dynamic traveling force among the people, a kind of life principle. This idea enlivens me. I ask questions. He uses his index finger to answer and make his points, shaking it at me. The finger is rarely still. I don't like the finger. He tells me that in Hua culture, women are pollutants, to which I say, oh. He is lecturing me now, and I notice he cannot keep his eyes on my face, despite the insistent finger. Hua women are semen stealers. They sap men's strength. With each drop of the precious fluid, the women grow stronger, more vital, more dangerous. Hua men strenuously battle the urge for sex because it will drain the life out of them. They have to hoard their goo just to stay alive. Aaron is adamant my breasts should know about this all-important sex-death connection. I begin to say something, but he continues. I think Aaron may want to smother himself to death between my very own tits, which is probably not a Hua practice. I cannot say, please look up at my face, Aaron. He probably doesn't even know he is speaking to my boobs. I am patient, but after a bit more of the hua hui, I feel pressure in my chest, a suffocating discomfort so strong I have to flee. I tell him I have an appointment and must run. It was so nice talking to you, so interesting. Good luck, yada, yada, yada. I begin to stand up, and Aaron reaches across from his table and grabs my wrist. He hisses, "You're beautiful. Did you know that? Really beautiful." I recall that my cheeks felt hot, and I stuttered. But now, only a few hours later, I am not sure what I said to him. He loosened his fingers from my arm, looked up at me with a pleading face, and I felt bad, that little tug beneath my ribs. I thanked him again for the conversation. I smiled. At the door, I gave him a wave. I could see the disappointment in his face, and it pierced me. I had been kind, but I felt as if I had been mean. I felt bruised, guilty, ashamed, humiliated, as if those various feelings were not distinct as they should have been, but had merged into an amorphous blob in my upper gut. I stood on the hot street and wondered if in an hour or so Aaron might not have improved. Maybe it would have been better to listen a little longer to stories about the hua just for his company. I am pining for a real conversation. And here's the truth. If he had kept his mouth shut and his eyes straight ahead, I might have jumped in bed with him just because of those adorable teeth. I'm skipping, it's back to the old narrator. Although I don't remember young Aaron Blinderman with any precision, he was one of many, and the many have been conflated in my mind to become one sort of man I encountered again and again, a man older or younger, whose eyes continually strayed from my face to parts below. A man who talked and talked and talked and asked me no questions. A helpful, smiling, knowing man who, for reasons that baffled me, seemed to believe I was incompetent in all matters, large and small. A man who, by the end of the evening, when I had risked dinner in my irrepressible hope for company and perhaps love, was all hands and saliva and urgent needs, and who now and again had to be forcibly pushed away. He, that reduction of many men into one man, inevitably looked betrayed and puzzled, or betrayed and miffed as he stood on the street or outside the door to my apartment, or sat beside me in a taxi, or had squeezed against me in a corner of a nightclub as the strobe lights flashed above us. Surely if that plural man remembers me at all, he remembers as I remember, not me, but my type, a tall blonde whose face he can no longer decipher. And if he remembers a person, it is unlikely he will recall what attracted him to me beyond my type. I too have become an absence or a blur in the mind of that multiple man, one of many comely young women who shut the door in his face. Sometimes memory is a knife. As I read through the pages of my old notebook in the guest room of the retirement complex, there were moments when I had to place the notebook face down on the night table to collect myself. When I reached the words, Aaron reaches across from his table and grabs my wrist, I began to tremble. I do not mean this figuratively. My hand shook as I read. What made that asshole think he had the right to seize my wrist? And I, or she, easier to say she, why did she protect the oh so delicate feelings of someone whose hectoring ways and pointed descriptions of the practices of that New Guinea tribe already counted as hostile acts? Rather than yank her wrist away from that pompous nincompoop and bark at him, she runs out the door and once on the street cannot comprehend why she feels wounded. nudge it, kick it, prod it, push it. The Baroness wrote those lines in a poem called "A Dozen Cocktails, Please." And as I lay there in the guest room of the retirement center, I nudged, kicked, prodded, and pushed Aaron Blinderman into the back wall of the Hungarian pastry shop. And I waggled my finger at him and stuck out my tongue and farted for good measure and roared into his amazed face that he should keep his goddamned hands off me without my express permission. And the rebellious fantasy relieved me. We are all wishful creatures, and we wish backward too, not only forward, and thereby rebuild the curious, crumbling architecture of memory into structures that are more habitable. I know I never backed young Blinderman against the wall, but I also know that I have countless memories that must be wrong, memories I have dressed up with wishes. Kari remembers differently from me, or she remembers and I forget, or I remember and she forgets. She is certain she saved our turtle Dinky from the jaws of the Harrington sheepdog Lawrence, and I am certain I held the dog's mouth as he slavered over my hands, and I plucked Dinky from his jaws. It is indisputably true that although each of us wished to have been the agent of that daring exploit, only one of us was the hero. And in the annals of our childhood, it is also true that the hero was usually Kari, not me. Thank you.
All right.
Comedy before tragedy. That's what we're doing here.
All right. So up next, we have a reading from Paul Auster. Paul is the best-selling author of 4321, Winter Journal, Sunset Park, Invisible, The Brooklyn Follies, The Book of Illusions, and the New York City Trilogy, among many other works. In 2006, he was awarded the Prince of Asturias Prize for Literature, and in 2012, he was the first recipient of the New York City Literary Honors in the category of fiction. He has also been a finalist for the International Impact Dublin Literary Award, the Penn Faulkner Award for Fiction, and the Edgar Award. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and his work has been translated into more than 40 languages. So please welcome Mr. Paul Auster.
Just Jill.
Oh, hi.
Okay, hi. Well, it's a very strange event because our lovely host there is a mute as far as I'm concerned, and it's very disconcerting. But I suppose everyone else can hear us. So I'm going to read something very different from Siri's sparkling piece of fiction there, that little slice of her extraordinary novel. I'm reading this, you see, it's in a manuscript and it's not been published yet. It's the most recent thing I finished. And it is actually a preface for a book of photographs by a photographer I admire very much. And I'm not going to say anything more because it's all explained within the text. And then you'll get an idea of what this is all about. The title is simply Tyler Kobe Nichols, 1999 to 2020. It was a weird and senseless crime. A sudden, unprovoked burst of violence on a tranquil street in a tranquil Brooklyn neighborhood on the eve of Christmas Eve. And 2 minutes after the attack began, 21-year-old Tyler Kobe Nichols collapsed onto the sidewalk with 3 knife wounds in his stomach and 1 in his back. He died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. Tyler and his 24-year-old brother, Shane, had gone out for holiday haircuts at a local barbershop just a few blocks from where they lived. They started home at around 7:45, the only pedestrians on the empty streets during this dark pandemic winter. And at the corner of Coney Island Avenue and Turner Place, within eyeshot of their own house, They noticed a car parked at the curb with 2 young men in it, both of them strangers. Double parked beside that car was another car with 3 more young men in it, all of them strangers as well. For reasons unknown, the 5 unknowns were staring at the Nichols brothers. I looked in the car, Shane told the Daily News, and then 2 kids came out. They asked us what we were looking at. Then they just started fighting us. Seconds later, the 3 from the other car joined in the attack, and suddenly it was 5 against 2. The brothers did what they could to defend themselves, but they were outnumbered and took their fair share of knocks. Unexpectedly, the 3 from the double-parked car suddenly stopped fighting, returned to their car, and drove off. A few moments after that, the first 2 piled into their car and drove off in the same direction. Shane looked over at Tyler and said, "Let's go." But Tyler was unresponsive. "I think I got stabbed," he said, and then, according to Shane, he just dropped to the ground. A 21-year-old kid goes out for a haircut and winds up bleeding to death on a Brooklyn sidewalk. "Nothing ever happens in this neighborhood," his brother told the news. "It's my first fight in the whole 20 years I've lived here." Nor was robbery a motive in the attack, since the $300 in Shane's wallet were untouched, as was the gold chain he was wearing around his neck. Had the stabbing been prompted by a gang initiation ritual, kill someone, anyone, in order to gain acceptance into the group? Or was it simply a random act of brutality committed by an angry, nihilistic teenage boy? Impossible to say. Also impossible to say just now whether the suspect the police have tentatively identified as the killer, as of yesterday, will turn out to have been guilty of the crime. I missed the story in the news and never would have learned of Tyler Nichols' death if not for the photographer Spencer Ostrander, who told me about it shortly after he made contact with the Nichols family. Roughly 6 months ago, I joined Ostrander in a project he had launched 2 years earlier on the epidemic of mass shootings that has spread across America in the past 2 decades. In that time, he has traveled widely through all regions of the country, taking photographs of more than 24 sites where these killings have occurred, not from some sensationalist impulse to cash in on the horrors of American violence, but from a personal commitment to memorialize those places as tokens of our collective national grief and force us to remember the savagery we have visited upon one another as bullet after bullet has wiped out thousands of innocent lives. I've been enlisted to write the preface to this work in progress, and in the course of our discussions over the past months, Ostrander's project has expanded beyond the sinister phenomenon of mass shootings to take on the bigger question of American gun violence in general, which kills 40,000 and wounds 80,000 men, women, and children every year. To that end, he has reached out to the survivors of gunshot wounds who are now permanently confined to wheelchairs, to the families of those who have been killed or wounded, and, with the permission of the parents, spouses, and relatives of the dead, has begun attending funerals of the victims. In this instance, the director of the funeral home made a mistake and told Ostrander that Tyler Nichols had been killed by a gun. He suggested that Ostrander come to the funeral early, where he would introduce him to Tyler Nichols' mother, Sherma Chambers, who would decide whether to allow him to take pictures during the service. And so it was that the 36-year-old Seattle-born photographer and the 52-year-old working mother, who was born on the island of St. Vincent and has been living in Brooklyn for close to 40 years, met for the first time. The fact that one was white and the other black had no bearing on the encounter. A human connection was established, and Ostrander was granted permission to stay. A week later, Sherma Chambers contacted Ostrander and invited him to her house in Kensington for a fuller conversation about his project and to talk to him about her son. Ostrander was well aware by then that his presence there had nothing to do with his years-long research into gun violence. But what did that matter? He had stumbled into the midst of a grieving household that was willing to share its stories with him and allow themselves to be photographed in their time of pain and mourning. And because Spencer Ostrander is a person of singular compassion and purity of purpose, the entire household trusted him, understanding that they would not be exploited, but instead would serve as exemplars of the binding human force that connects us in times of sorrow. I look into your face and see myself. Such is the power of photographic portraiture when it manages to achieve its highest objective. I become you. It is not possible to talk about Tyler Nichols's life without first understanding something about the house his family has owned since 1990. A 3-story wooden structure with 2 front porches, a basement apartment, and a kitchen on every floor that has functioned historically as a small, self-contained village inhabited by members of the Nichols Chambers family. A rock-solid, trans-generational household that has held fast in an age of ever-dwindling and ever more dispersed American families. On the day before Tyler's death, 15 people were living there. Tyler and his 2 older brothers, Shane and Shamari, 29, his mother, his mother's mother, and 2 of his mother's sisters, several of his first cousins, Shamari's wife, Vera, the couple's little daughter, Rain, Shane's girlfriend, Brittany, and Tyler's girlfriend, Ashley, who had moved in 3 years earlier when she was 18. The 2 kids had met at school when they were 11 and had been in love ever since. Except for the little girl and her great-grandmother, everyone who lived in the house worked at a full-time job. Everyone pitched in. Everyone pulled together. None of that has changed since the night of December 23rd. The only difference is that 14 people live there now, not 15. And the space that Tyler occupied has been turned into an enormous hole. It was that house and that hole that Ostrander walked into on the afternoon of his first visit, where one by one, he talked to various members of the family about Tyler and asked them to sit for a preliminary round of photographs. For his second visit, he carried along a tape recorder and spent several hours conducting separate interviews with Tyler's mother, Sherma, his brothers, Shane and Shamari, Shamari's wife, Vera, and a 28-year-old first cousin, Karim Usebe, a college graduate with a degree in biomedical technology. And little by little, a picture began to emerge of a last-born tyke tagging along after his older brothers until he was off to kindergarten and the grades beyond, at which point he began participating in after-school programs at PS 282 and Park Slope, where he studied and progressed at such divergent activities as fencing, the steel drums, and the piano. And then, as he moved into his late pre-adolescent boyhood, his passion for skateboarding, for which he showed an immense talent, far surpassing the abilities of his older brother Shane. And as the clock ticked on and he entered middle school in Ditmas Park, his early puppy love romance with Ashley, a deepening involvement with music, and almost inevitably, given that his middle name had been inspired by Kobe Bryant, a turn toward basketball, at which he soon began to excel, which in turn led to a stint at Bryant's summer basketball camp in Santa Barbara, California, where he caught the attention of the Great One for the promise he showed on the court. And before long, when Tyler entered Erasmus High School in Flatbush, he wound up as a standout shooting guard on the JV team, freshman and sophomore years, and then the varsity as a junior and senior. The 2 Kobes were captured together in a memorable photograph from that summer in Santa Barbara. And how bitter it is to think that both of them are now dead. The older one on January 26th, and the younger one on December 23rd, at opposite ends of the dark, devastating year that was 2020. He was an old soul in a young man's body, a quiet, contemplative person who spent much of his spare time alone. And yet Tyler matured so quickly in the last 2 years of his life that he became the moral center of the family. In spite of his age, he was the person the others turned to for advice, for help in solving problems and resolving conflicts, because he was the one who could read human situations more clearly and impartially than anyone else. The heart of what he told them never varied. Be honest with yourself and others. Act responsibly. Do not blame others for your own faults or blunders. And if you stick to these principles, there's a good chance you will be able to overcome the impediments that stand before you. Ancient wisdom from the lips of a boy just barely into his 20s. As one of his good friends said at the funeral service on January 10th, whatever I was going through, I could always talk to him. He was always there for me. And his older cousin, Kareem, went so far as to describe him as a musician, a therapist, an athlete, an alleviator, and a role model. Some weeks later, during his conversation with Ostrander, he called Tyler the sharpest edge of the family, and that he absorbed everything. Almost in astonishment, he marveled at his cousin's sharp, analytical mind and the surge of inner growth that seemed to have transformed him in recent months. Imagine a flower blooming before your eyes, he said, and then someone comes along one day and clips the root from below. Meanwhile, the family is still grieving. Tyler's mother and brother Shane and girlfriend Ashley still talk about him in the present tense, as if he were hiding out somewhere in one of the rooms of the house. Tyler's empty boots continued to sit on the floor below the foot of the bed he shared with Ashley, and she has turned her dressing table into a small shrine of their life together, with an assemblage of photographs and numerous intimate personal artifacts. The life-size cutout photograph of Tyler that stood by the chapel entrance on the day of the funeral now stands on the ground floor of the house. He is there with them still, there and yet not there, as his image and the memory of that image continue to reign over the ravaged household. One wants to howl forth curses at the injustice of it all, but what judge can we turn to at such a time? And what human or extra-human force can put the scales of justice back in balance? The skies are silent. The earth is silent. Not even the most powerful God can undo what has already been done. He was the homebody of the clan, the one who famously never wanted to go out to do anything that was not strictly necessary. But on the evening of December 23rd, he decided to break the pattern and leave the house with his brother Shane to have his haircut at Leroy's barbershop on Church Avenue. That night, he would be attending the birthday party of one of his closest friends. There would be Christmas Eve dinner the following night, and the day after that would be Christmas, with the whole family gathered on the ground floor and celebrating in full force. And Tyler wanted to look his best for those Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday events. As it happened, he was in uncommonly good spirits that day. And a few hours before he left the house with Shane, he began talking about how lucky his life had been so far and how many extraordinary opportunities he had been given, from fencing lessons to piano lessons to basketball camp to various trips to distant places. And though he was looking back that day, there was much to look forward to as well, since he had recently finished his studies at the School of Cooperative Technical Education, Co-op Tech, and was now a licensed electrician, which would have opened the door to a lifetime of productive work. And before long, he and Ashley no doubt would have been married. As she continued her training as an assistant elementary school teacher, it is almost certain that a day would have come when they began to talk about starting a family. How chilling it is in retrospect to remember that speech of gratitude and happiness, and to realize that those words were spoken just hours before his death, when a perfect stranger jumped out of a car and saw fit to end Tyler Kobe Nichols' brief journey through life with 3 stab wounds into his belly and 1 into his back. On the day of the funeral, Tyler's mother stood up in front of a room packed with mourners and openly confessed her grief and how difficult it was to bear. But she did not talk in anger against the unknown boy who had killed her son and did not call for revenge. She simply said, "I promise you one thing. Tyler's name will never be forgotten." After an anguished pause, she went on, "Tyler was brought up in love, and his murderer was not brought up in love. And one day she would like to meet that person and other lost boys from the street to show them what love is." And then she announced that she was planning to start a foundation in her son's name called Long Live King Kobe. 2 months later, that foundation is up and running. Any and all proceeds from the sale of this book will be donated to Sherma Chambers' cause. So that's the end of my little preface, dated March 4th, 2021. Now, Siri will join me again as we are in this silent movie.
We're wheeling over here.
Yeah.
And I think somehow we should be maybe signaled in the chat when you want to cut us off.
Yeah.
I think that's
Well,
that's legit here.
I have a question for Siri. We're going to ask
go
each
back
other
and
a
forth a little
question.
bit.
Okay,
But-
so here's my rather long-winded question. In 2019, before the pandemic year, you won 3 major literary awards around the world. Here in America, an American Academy of Arts and Letters Prize for the body of your work, the European Essay Prize for The Delusions of Certainty, a philosophical examination of the mind-body problem, and the Princess of Asturias Prize for Literature, again, for the body of your work. Only the 7th American to win this award. In the citation, they emphasized that the prize was going to you they emphasized that the prize was going to you for both your novels and your essays and books on science and philosophy and visual art. And so I want to ask you, even though I've lived with you for 40 years, how do you manage to maintain this double life, doing both things with such excellence? It's a mystery to me.
I think I should point out to everyone who's listening that when it was called the Prince of Asturias Award in Spain, Paul won it in 2006, way before I did.
That's of no importance.
Just to say, the double life thing is really interesting. I think if someone had told me when I was a child that I would grow up and write novels, I would have said yes, that's true. But if someone had said, you will publish papers in scientific journals and give lectures to neurologists and psychiatrists, I would have said, I don't think that's possible. I don't think that's going to happen. But it did happen, and it came out of, I think, just a lot of reading and a lot of curiosity. I share with my narrator that I am interested in everything. So when I'm possessed by an interest, I pursue it. And that
I can attest, sharing this house with you, the incredible number of papers and books Siri reads. I would say half her day is given over to her writing, and the other half is given over to reading. And she reads a lot, and she reads and remembers things. I read things, and I can't remember anything.
Well,
you have a talent for remembering every argument and every paper you.
Well,
and
we'll
book.
see. We'll see how long that lasts. I'm getting old, but so far, I think I still remember.
But do you feel it as a conflict or just simply as complementary activities?
I've started to feel, I think in my old age now, that these are merging in a way more and more. There's something very different about writing fiction. There's a kind of freedom, but also, an openness that is actually more terrifying than writing nonfiction or composing a paper, because it already has a form.
Mhm.
But I don't want to give up either. And so I pursue them. And I think even in my fiction now, possibly it's present in Memories of the Future, in The Blazing World. I have a tendency to use material that I've taken from my reading and from other work.
I mean, the other thing you've done is written extensively about visual art. I mean, many essays on painting and sculpture and drawing, and an astonishing amount, really. And I know that in some of your novels, you have invented artists. You create the works of these imaginary artists, imaginary works, which are really quite interesting. One would like to see them.
But I think, you obviously we can't do everything, but I think in the novels, I was able to play out a fantasy of mine, which has always been so I decided to be a writer when I was 13, but before that I wanted to be a visual artist.
Well, Siri's a very good artist. I mean, she can really draw beautifully. But you went in the other direction.
No.
Now you want to ask me a question?
Yes, I'm going to ask him basically the same thing, that you've had multiple lives as a writer. You started as a poet, and you've written essays. You've made 4 movies. You've edited a couple of anthologies, and you've just finished a huge book on the life and work of Stephen Crane, a kind of expansive biography. You've never written a biography before. Yeah. And I have to say, when you started, I thought, why is he doing that?
I kept asking myself that question too.
And I have to say, okay, I'm bragging, but it's the truth. It's really a wonderful book. It's coming out in October. But you have also juggled a number of different.
Well, I was thinking about how to answer this because, you see, what amazes me about you is that you somehow are able to keep all these different activities going simultaneously. Whereas I've started looking back on my various activities, and they've usually fallen into different periods of my life.
Right.
For example, when I was young, I was writing poetry and translating poetry and writing occasional essays, but they were all about poets. And I was translating poetry. And then my dream was always to write novels. And I had tried early in my late teens and early 20s, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of aborted works that I was never happy with, to such a degree of unhappiness that I abandoned it all and said, I'm never going to write prose. It's impossible for me to do it. But then time went on, and I eventually did start writing prose.
Yeah.
And once I did, I stopped doing poetry. I couldn't do it anymore. And I stopped translating pretty much. And
that's right.
mostly stopped. And I mostly stopped writing essays.
Yeah.
For a long, long time. Occasionally, I've written autobiographical works or works inspired by things that have happened to me that are not really autobiographical or memoirs so much as meditations on how the experiences we all go through in life that fascinate me. Movies, were always a passion of mine. And in fact, at age 20, I thought of going to film school. But then I realized at the time I was so shy, so unable to talk in front of strangers. If 2 or 3 people I didn't know were in the room, I thought, how can I direct a movie if I can't talk? So I gave that up. But then later, as a novelist, people started knocking on the door, and I got sucked into it, working on 2 films with Wayne Wang, and I enjoyed it tremendously, and then went on to make 2 others. But I think that period of my life is over. And right now, after having written the longest novel of my life, 4321, in the absolute exhaustion that followed, I started reading Crane again. And I got so sucked into the brilliance of this young man's work. He died at 28 after all. I thought, I'll write a nice little book about Stephen Crane. This will be a good thing to get me back on my feet. And so the little book turned into a very fat book. But I never regretted it, but I never quite understood why I was doing it.
Well,
do we have?
Ask one more. We'll ask the one
I'll
more.
ask one more question.
Yeah, we have a little bit.
So I want to go back to your reading, what you read from today, and the section of the novel, and why you chose this section. And it seems to me very interesting that this was written before the birth of the Me Too movement, and yet it seems to be a perfect example of why that movement came into being. And so I just want to know what inspired you to invent this passage and put it in the novel.
Well, it is not, this book is playing with memoir and autobiography, and the narrator's initials are SH, that's all you know. And of course, they're my initials. But actually, the events of the book are not from my life, except that they're set exactly in my life, in the details of New York at the time. The place and time are all, authentic, but not the events. But you know what? It is a book about memory and time. And what interests me about an old person looking back at a young person is that memory becomes recontextualized. And I do think that that's part of a wider, broader cultural reality. In the very first paragraph of the book, the narrator says, what I didn't understand then was that as I wrote, I was also being written. And I think we are all being written by the myths and the stories that are given in a culture. And we do not understand how deep and profound those stories, those myths that we work with. Now, part of that is, of course, in feminism, you see this, but it goes into other things, race, xenophobia, all of these ideas that are inherited in a culture. And it's only when cultures change that one starts to see a reconfiguration, literally, of memory. And so she remembers her old self, and it's brought back to her very clearly.
But why this? The hand on the wrist?
Because it's an invasive gesture, and it's one I think that women have been tolerating over and over again for years and years and years, for decades, and then feeling guilty as if, you didn't come through for someone who was aggressive. And that's, I think this is a big thing. I've certainly felt it in my own life, all the intrusions I tolerated, and then felt kind of bad about. But indeed, in a case like that, it isn't me, it's the other one. Now, should I ask you before it's like we have?
I don't know. I'm
two
just
minutes?
looking to see if we can get questions
late.
from the audience or not. I just don't know.
There she is.
Paul and Siri,
Click ask a question
under the video to see the questions
down
submitted
here
by the audience.
Oh,
we're getting a gesture to
oh
go
my
down.
goodness. Oh, I see. Keep Paul and Siri.
Oh, I see.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Okay, there's so
Let's
many.
see. There we go. No, it's not
when you're
that
working
many.
on a novel, how do you decide?
Okay, let's read it. So Paul and Siri, when you are working on a novel and you have ideas and possibilities coming to you throughout it, how do you decide which to try, which to discard, and which could be put aside for other projects? thank you in advance, and thank you for the profound impact your writing has had on my life. Thank you, Nancy Carter. That's a lovely thing to say. Well, I tried to write the book that became Memories of the Future, but it was a different book, and I worked on it for over a year. And it was a failed, dead thing. I can't explain how it was an awful experience, but I have a feeling that in order to write the book I finally wrote, I had to write the bad one. And you said you put away.
I'm blocked out.
Sorry.
I don't know what to do.
No, what do you mean?
Well, this thing is in front of my face. Can everyone see me?
Oh no, you just talk. Of course they can see you.
Oh, okay.
You just talk to the screen.
Oh, all right. I just have this big.
It's fine.
All
You
these questions
answer. You just talk.
Okay. All my novels evolve differently. Some of them have taken me 20 years to write, from beginning to end, from first thought to last thought, and first word to last word. They always evolve. They never wind up being what I thought they were going to be when I started. I think the most important thing is to discard the things that are not essential. And I can only work by writing the first sentence and then the second sentence. I can't jump around, and I find the book as I'm doing it. I know some people map everything out. They have a plan, a real itinerary about how they can do it, but I just can't imagine that. I don't know where the adventure is then. It's just you've already lived it and you're just recording it. Whereas the writing for me is the adventure, and it's and you're always uncertain, and you're filled with doubt.
We agree with that. Now, and then this is, how do you
writers
create characters? Isn't that an interesting question? I think, with me, someone starts to come, someone starts to speak. You have a sense of some other voice in your head. And once that started to grow, then sometimes before I go to sleep, the characters are talking to each other before I go to sleep in my head.
To me, the characters, they're like visitations from another world, I guess, from deep within my inner world. And they take on life. And I think of my fictional characters as real as you are to me now, sitting beside me, flesh and blood in 3 dimensions. It's quite extraordinary. And nearly every character I've ever written about, whether major or minor in a book, has come with his or her name, and I haven't changed it. It's as if I had no choice. Only once or twice have I changed names because I realized that there were certain resonances that I hadn't been aware of.
Right, and you didn't want it.
But other than that, no. And I still think about my characters.
I do too.
Yeah. I wonder what they're doing now.
And I think not all writers do. Some people.
Who do we like to read?
Yes. Do you like to read?
Oh, how
do
did
you
I
have
come
a favorite book of all time?
How did I come to? Oh, I can tell you that. It's
Which one? Which are you asking?
Book of Illusions. The Book of Illusions. It was just simply. I got into my head the idea about a silent movie comedian, and I think I don't know if anyone's seen the 60s movie Divorce Italian Style with Marcello Mastroianni. He's got a little mustache and he walks around in a white suit throughout the whole thing. And I imagined this Mastroianni character not as Marcello himself, but as an earlier incarnation of the silent film comedian. And at first, I thought I would like to just invent a whole bunch of silent comedies for my character, Hector Mann, I called him. And just write out the comedies as short stories. Well, one thing led to another, and of course it became something quite different. But it took years for this thing to mutate into what it became.
So that's good. So, a favorite book of all time. You know how they're about every 10 years. I always get asked to do one of those things. Put down your 10 favorite books. And I always do 10 different books because I have about 500 favorite books. Yeah. And so that thing that of all time, it's it's something that I resist simply because I'm a pluralist. And the idea that there could be one single epitome of the reading experience is not my experience.
Mhm.
And I don't think it's yours either.
No, I could make up several different lists of 10 favorite books. It's so vast. Why reduce it to that? And I insist that art is not the Olympics. There is no
Yes.
best.
That's right.
I mean, it all
That's
depends
right.
on what you want that particular
It's
day.
also, and art
There's-
is not a competition, right? I
No.
think in our culture, there's this tendency to want to, narrow everything down and make those distinctions. And of course, memory and time often change those ideas
Listen,
about what was the
sometimes-
most wonderful thing.
Sometimes if you're a carnivore, you want a nice big juicy hamburger, right? But other times, nothing satisfies more than a little stalk of celery or a saltine, right?
Right.
You can't eat on hamburgers all the time.
No, but I can say one thing, that every week I read Emily Dickinson, at least one poem. And I do it because when I read Dickinson, I understand what the English language can do, that it can go that far. And, the emotional impact of Dickinson's poems that are often very mysterious is something that I keep reading to try to understand what the heck that is. I mean, talk about a genius. And that she was an American, we Americans should be very proud of.
Yes, and it's also instructive to know that she was essentially unpublished when she died and unknown.
Yes.
And so much
Yeah,
for
she's back.
what's going on in the literary world at any given moment. We don't know who's writing out there.
We're
I think
rounding it
done.
up. We're
I think
rounding
we're
it up.
done.
And thank you so much. And we're so sorry that I don't know what we did, if we did something wrong,
That's okay.
so we can't hear it, but there. That's a wrap.
That's a wrap. Thank you,
Thank
Paul
you.
and Siri. And the silent comedy ends. Thank you. Bye.
Yes,
so
I'm
much.
going to
Bye.
use my very limited sign language to say thank you to Paul and Siri for participating tonight. Thank you to everyone who tuned in, and to Roger Rosenblatt for dreaming this all up. Don't forget to click the button below to purchase signed copies of Paul and Siri's books. And we will see you right back here on Monday next week, 7 p.m. with Mr. Carlos Fonseca and Rose Styron. So until then, have a good one. Bye, everyone.